She was 18 years old and she had been thrown out with 2 hours to pack. No warning, no softening of the word. Her stepfather had stood in the doorway of her room with his arms crossed and told her that the house was his now, that the estate had been settled, and that she had until 4 o'clock. She had a single duffel bag, a jar with $61 saved from 2 summers of waitressing at the diner on Route 9, and a listing she had found 3 days earlier in the back pages of the Harwick Penny Saver that described a decommissioned cider mill on 12 acres of old orchard land in Dennistown, Vermont, available for immediate sale at $1 due to unpaid municipal liens. The listing said the structure had not been used in over 20 years. It said the press room was intact. It said nothing about what was hidden inside it, nothing about what had been placed there deliberately, out of reach, by a woman who had spent the last years of her life making sure the right person would eventually find it. If this is your first time here and stories like this one stay with you, I would be glad if you subscribed. It means more than I can say. And please drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from. I read every one. Nora Vance had grown up in Harwick, which was a town of 4,000 people in central Vermont, the kind of place that had a covered bridge and a general store and a town hall that got repainted every decade whether it needed it or not. Her mother's name was Ellen. Ellen Vance had been a reference librarian for 19 years, a careful reader, a person who wrote thank you notes by hand and kept a bowl of wrapped caramels on the circulation desk for anyone who needed one. She had married Nora's father, a man named Paul, when Nora was 2, and Paul had died when Nora was 7, and Ellen had managed the years after his death with the steady, slightly exhausted competence of someone who knows that falling apart is not among the options available to her. When Nora was 12, Ellen married a man named Robert Creel. He was not unkind in obvious ways. He did not raise his voice. He was punctual, and he paid his bills, and he had opinions about lawn care and vehicle maintenance that he expressed with the quiet authority of someone who has never been told his opinions were not welcome. Ellen loved him. Or she loved something about him. The steadiness, maybe. Or the fact that he showed up the way Paul had not quite been able to, in the end, through no fault of his own. Nora understood this, or tried to. She was 12. She tried. What she did not understand, because she was 12 and then 14 and then 17, was that Robert Creel had views about inheritance that he had never stated plainly to anyone. Because plainly stated, they would have sounded like what they were. He had views about what was owed to a wife's child from a prior marriage. He had views about the difference between legal obligation and genuine entitlement. He had views most crucially about a piece of property that Ellen had inherited from her own mother, a farmhouse and 11 acres outside of Harwick that Ellen had never sold, that she had rented to a local farmer for $400 a month and planned, in the way that mothers plan these things, to eventually pass to her daughter. Ellen died in March of Nora's senior year of high school. A stroke, fast and final, on a Tuesday evening, at the kitchen table. Nora had been upstairs. She had heard nothing until it was over. The will was read 6 weeks later at an attorney's office in Montpelier. Robert had hired his own attorney. That attorney had brought a document that Robert had prepared and that Ellen had signed 14 months before she died, during a period when she was managing a new diagnosis and a medication adjustment, and was. The attending physician would later note in records that Nora was not permitted to see, experiencing episodes of significant cognitive fatigue. The document directed the farmhouse and the 11 acres to the estate to be liquidated, with proceeds distributed equally between Robert and any surviving issue of the marriage. Ellen had no children with Robert. Nora was the surviving issue. She received, after the sale of the farmhouse, $11,000, which Robert's attorney presented as a generous outcome given the liens on the property. The attorney for the estate, an older man named Wallace Horn, who had handled Ellen's affairs for years and who sat across the conference table from Robert and Robert's attorney, with an expression of careful professional neutrality that cost him visible effort to maintain, handed Nora the check without comment. He held her gaze for 3 seconds longer than he needed to. That was all he could do. It was all the law permitted him. Nora had not understood, sitting in that conference room in Montpellier, that the $11,000 was the last of what her mother had meant to leave her. She understood it 3 weeks later, when she went home to Harwick and Robert stood in the doorway of her room and told her she had until 4 o'clock. She did not argue. She packed. She took the duffel bag and the $61 and the check, which she had not yet deposited, and she put them in her car, a 2001 Subaru with a cracked rear bumper she had bought herself with $800, and maintained herself with the help of a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed socket set. And she drove east on Route 9 until she was far enough from Harwick that the familiarity of the road stopped telling her to turn around. She had found the penny saver listing at the Harwick Public Library 3 days before the door. She had gone there because it was her mother's library, and because Agnes Whitmore, who had taken over the reference desk after Ellen retired, still kept a bowl of caramels on the circulation desk and did not ask questions about why a 17-year-old was sitting in the periodicals room at 2 in the afternoon, on a school day, reading 3-week-old classified listings. She had folded the listing into her jacket pocket. She had not known then that she would need it so soon. The Dennistown town clerk's office was a low wooden building next to the post office on the main road, and the clerk, a woman named Paulette Goss, who had held the position for 23 years, looked at Nora across the counter with the kind of steady, non-judging attention that women in small Vermont towns have often developed toward young women who come in looking like they have recently been somewhere they are not anymore. "You want the Aldrich Mill," Paulette said. "Not a question." "Is that what it's called?" Nora said. "That's what it's been called for 60 years. Paulette pulled a folder from a filing drawer behind her. "Harriet Aldrich operated it for 34 years. She passed in 2003. No heirs filed for the property. Municipal liens accumulated. We've been waiting for someone to come in with $1. Has anyone?" Paulette looked at her over her reading glasses. "You're the first." She put Nora's dollar in the petty cash box and stamped the deed and slid it across the counter, and then she paused and said, in the tone of someone offering information rather than advice, that the property had not had power since 2004, that the well would need a pressure test before anyone could rely on it, and that the Aldrich family had been well regarded in Dennistown for a long time, and she hoped whoever took the place would treat it accordingly. "I will," Nora said. "Good," Paulette said. She went back to her work. The mill was a mile and a half down a gravel road off Route 12, at the far end of what had once been a working orchard, 12 acres of apple trees, mostly old varieties, Cortland and Northern Spy, and a row of Roxbury russets along the north boundary that Nora would not be able to name for another 8 months, not until the neighbor told her. The trees had not been pruned in 20 years, and they showed it. Long, ungainly branches crossing each other at wrong angles. Water sprouts growing straight up from the main limbs. Some trees so overgrown they had become more sculpture than orchard. But they were alive. Every one of them, even the oldest, was alive, and several of them still had last autumn's dried apples hanging in the high branches like small, stubborn ornaments. The mill itself was a 2-story timber frame building, post and beam, built in the 1880s, with cedar shingle siding that had gone the color of old pewter, and a roof that had lost perhaps a third of its shingles on the west slope, and replaced them with a spreading stain of green moss. The foundation was fieldstone, dry laid, and had not shifted. That was the first thing she looked for, the way a person looks for the thing that matters most when everything else is in question, and the foundation was sound. The first floor was the press room. The second floor was where Harriet Aldrich had lived, 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen and a window on the south side that looked out across the orchard toward the mountains, which were blue and very far away. The kitchen still had a cast-iron wood stove with a cracked firebox door that could be replaced. There was a cot frame without a mattress, and a shelf of paperback novels with their spines bleached by old sunlight, and a pair of reading glasses folded on the windowsill as if someone had set them down and meant to come back. Nora did not move the reading glasses. She could not say exactly why. She left them where they were. The stairs between the floors were steep and solid. The press room itself had a packed earth floor and a ceiling of hand-hewn beams, and at its center, the press, a rack and cloth screw press, all cast iron and oak, 7 feet tall, built sometime in the 1920s, still bolted to a timber platform that had not moved in 100 years. It was coated in a century of oxidized apple must, the pressed-out pulp of 1,000 harvests, which gave it a smell that was somewhere between vinegar and caramel, and something older than either. On the south wall of the press room, above the sorting table, someone had painted a sign in black letters on the whitewashed plank siding. The paint was old, and the letters had faded at the edges, but they were still fully legible. They said, "Everything worth keeping goes through the press twice." Nora stood and read it. She read it a second time. She did not know yet who had painted it, or when, or exactly what it meant in the life of the woman who had lived and worked here. She thought, "I will find out." She slept in the Subaru the first night, in the orchard lane, with the windows cracked. The second night she slept in Harriet Aldrich's upstairs room, on the floor, in the sleeping bag she had bought at a Goodwill in Montpelier for $4. The third morning she walked the full perimeter of the 12 acres, and she wrote everything she saw into a spiral notebook. The trees, the stone walls, the collapsed equipment shed at the northeast corner, the spring box at the edge of the north boundary that still had cold water moving through it. She wrote it all down with the careful attention of someone who is not yet sure what any of it means, but is certain that not seeing clearly first would be a mistake she could not afford. It was on the 4th day that she found the loose board. She had been cleaning the press room, sweeping the floor, pulling dead leaves and debris from the corners, getting a sense of what was there before she started imagining what might be done with it. The press was at the center. The sorting table was along the south wall. Against the north wall was a long storage shelf, floor to ceiling, built from rough sawn lumber and held together with square head nails, the kind that had not been manufactured since before the First World War. The shelf held an assortment of old equipment, wooden crates, a stack of cheesecloth filters, several worn rubber gaskets for the press, a hand-painted price list from 1987. And on the lowest shelf, pushed back into the corner, there was a section of the vertical support board that did not sit flush with the shelf frame. Not by much, 1/2 inch, maybe less. But Nora had grown up in old houses, and she knew the sound of a board that had been pulled away from its backing more than once. It had a different tone when you pressed on it. This one had that tone. She pressed. The board gave slightly. She worked her fingers behind it and pulled, and it came free. Not broken, not rotted, but deliberately loosened and refitted, the nail holes old and the nail heads absent, replaced by 2 small finish screws that had been painted over and were nearly invisible unless you were looking. Behind the board was a narrow cavity, perhaps 8 inches deep, built into the space between the shelf frame and the exterior wall, and in the cavity was a tin box, the kind that once held shortbread cookies, sealed around its lid with a wrap of wax paper and a rubber band that crumbled when she touched it. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't yet. What Nora found in that tin would take the next several months to fully understand, and the understanding, when it finally came, would change not just her future, but her past. Hold on. She did not open the box that day. She set it on the sorting table, and she looked at it, and she thought about the board with the finished screws and the wax paper seal. And she thought about Paulette Goss saying that the Aldrich family had been well regarded in Dennistown for a long time, and she hoped whoever came would treat the place accordingly. And she thought, this was put here to be found. The same way the board in the tower. No, different. This was Harriet Aldrich's mill. This was Harriet Aldrich's tin. And before she opened it, she wanted to know who Harriet Aldrich was. The neighbor's name was Frank Del Vecchio. He was 71 years old, and he farmed the 60 acres east of the mill property, a mix of hay and vegetable ground, and his own small apple block. And he had grown up in Dennistown and had known Harriet Aldrich his entire life, in the way that you know someone who has always been part of the landscape of a place, not intimately, not continuously, but with the accumulated depth of 60 years of small interactions. He came over on the 5th day, which was the day Nora finally swept the orchard lane clear enough to turn the Subaru around without bottoming out. And he stood at the edge of the lane and looked at her and then at the mill, and then at her again. "You bought it," he said. "For $1, she said. He nodded, as if $1 was exactly the right price. "Harriet would have liked that," he said. "She always said the mill should go to someone who needed it, not someone who wanted it." He told her about Harriet Aldrich over the following weeks, in pieces, the way people in small towns share information, a little at a time, as trust builds, never all at once. Harriet had run the mill from 1969 until 2001, when her health began to fail. She had pressed cider in the fall and sold it at the farm stand at the end of the lane, and at the Dennistown General Store, and at the Harwick Farmers Market, driving her truck 40 minutes each way every Saturday morning from mid-September through November. She had been known, Frank said, for a particular practice that she had maintained without exception for 34 years. Anyone in Dennistown who brought their own apples to the mill could have them pressed for free. No charge. You brought the apples, Harriet ran the press, you took the cider home. She had done this for farm families, for elderly widowers with a single tree in the backyard, for the elementary school class that came every October to see how the press worked. She had done it, Frank said, because her father had done it before her, and his mother before him, and because she believed that a mill only meant something if it belonged to the whole of the place it sat in, and not just to the person who owned it. Nora wrote this down in her spiral notebook. She opened the tin box on a Thursday evening in late May, at the sorting table, with the south window propped open, and the orchard smelling of apple blossom. The trees, overgrown and unpruned as they were, had flowered, every last one, in a long, extravagant bloom that surprised her with its abundance. She pried the lid off carefully. Inside, wrapped in a layer of oilcloth, were 3 things. The first was a letter, handwritten on 2 sheets of lined paper, dated April 2001. The second was a document, folded 4 times, on heavier paper that had the texture of something official. The third was a photograph, black and white, of 2 women standing in front of the mill, laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in the same handwriting as the letter, were 2 names and a year, Ellen and Harriet, 1971. Nora put the photograph down. She put it down carefully, the way you put down something that has suddenly become heavier than it was a moment ago. She looked at it for a long time without picking it back up. The woman on the left was young, 20, maybe 22, with dark hair and a wide, delighted smile. Her head turned slightly toward the woman beside her. Nora had seen that smile in photographs her whole life. It was in the framed photograph on the circulation desk at the Harwick Public Library, the one Agnes Whitmore had put up after Ellen retired. It was in the photograph on Nora's phone case, the one she had chosen to keep when she packed the duffel bag, because it was the one that looked most like her mother at her best. It was the smile her mother made when something actually surprised her with its goodness. Her mother had known Harriet Aldrich. Her mother had stood in front of this mill in 1971, laughing, in a friendship that had lasted years, and then faded the way friendships do across the distance of full lives, and that had, without either woman knowing it, left something here for Nora to find 50 years later. She read the letter. Harriet Aldrich had written it in April of 2001, when she knew her health was not going to improve. She had written it, she explained, because she had no heirs and no one she trusted to act as executor, and because there were things she needed to be said, on paper, by her, before she was gone. She wrote that she had known Ellen Whitfield, Ellen's name before she married Paul Vance, since 1969, when Ellen had come to Dennistown as part of a college work-study program at a local farm, and they had been, for the 4 years Ellen lived in the area, close friends. She wrote that when Ellen left to marry and begin her library career, they had stayed in touch for years, and when they had eventually lost touch, as people do across the distance of full lives, it had been without any coldness. She wrote that she had heard, through the gradual accumulation of mutual acquaintances across the decades, that Ellen had a daughter. She wrote that she had thought about that daughter, at various times, in the way you think about people you have never met, but are nonetheless connected to by the long threads of a life. The official document was a quitclaim deed, signed by Harriet Aldrich in 2001, conveying the mill property and all 12 acres to Ellen Vance, formerly Whitfield of Harwick, Vermont. It had never been recorded. Harriet had written in the letter that she had prepared it and had intended to send it to Ellen, but had then decided against. She had not wanted to burden a woman with a family and a life with an old mill and its complications. She had folded it and put it in the tin and hoped. She had written, "If the person who finds this is Ellen, take the deed to the town clerk and have it recorded and the place is yours. If it is not Ellen, then Providence has done something I didn't plan for, and I trust that too." She had signed the letter with her full name and the date and, below that, in a different pen, as if added later, P.S. The orchard will come back. Give it time. They always do. Nora sat with the letter and the deed and the photograph of her mother at 22, laughing, in front of a mill she had never known she was meant to inherit, for a long time. The apple blossoms moved in the south window. The press stood at the center of the room, iron and oak, coated in a century of work. Above the sorting table, the painted letters said, "Everything worth keeping goes through the press twice." She called Wallace Horn the next morning. He was the attorney who had sat across the table from Robert Creel in Montpelier and held her gaze for 3 seconds. He answered on the second ring. She told him what she had found. There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Then he said, in the measured tone of a man choosing his words with great care, "Miss Vance, I would like you to bring those documents to my office at your earliest convenience. I believe we may have something to discuss." Wallace Horn was a thorough man. He spent 3 weeks. He reviewed the quitclaim deed, which was validly executed under Vermont law. He reviewed the timeline of the Aldrich estate, which had passed through municipal lien proceedings rather than probate, meaning the deed had never surfaced in any legal review. He reviewed the municipal lien records and determined that the dollar Nora had paid had cleared the liens and established clean title. He reviewed the question of whether the quitclaim deed to Ellen could be inherited by Ellen's heirs, given that it had never been recorded in Ellen's lifetime. He consulted with a colleague who specialized in estate law. He came back to Nora at the end of the 3 weeks and told her that the situation was legally complex, but that his considered opinion was that she had a strong claim. He agreed to represent her, and he did not ask for a retainer. The case took 11 months. It did not go to trial. Robert Creel's attorney reviewed the documents and the legal analysis, and after 6 weeks of correspondence recommended that his client consider a settlement rather than litigation. Robert Creel settled. The terms were confidential, but Paulette Goss, who knew everything that happened in Dennistown, mentioned to Nora one afternoon across the town clerk's counter that she had heard the mill property had been quietly confirmed and that she was glad. Nora did not contact Robert Creel. She did not need to. She heard, eventually, through Agnes Whitmore, who had taken over her mother's desk at the Harwick Library and who had a wide network of small-town intelligence, that Robert had heard what had happened. Agnes said he had not said anything when he heard. He had simply gone quiet, the way people go quiet when they understand, too late, that they had underestimated something they should have paid more attention to. Nora had the press serviced by a man named Teddy Ouimet, who had repaired farm equipment in Dennistown for 40 years and who spent one October morning going over every inch of the rack and cloth mechanism with the unhurried attention of someone who finds old machinery interesting, rather than inconvenient. He said the press was sound. He replaced 2 wooden racks and 1 rubber gasket and oiled the screw thread and stepped back and told her it would outlast both of them. The first pressing was in October, 14 months after she had slept in the Subaru in the orchard lane. She had spent the summer pruning. Frank Del Vecchio had taught her, 1 tree at a time. Standing in the orchard with his hands on the branches and explaining in plain language why each cut went where it went and what the tree would do in response. The pruning was too late in the season to be ideal, he said, but the trees were forgiving. They had been through worse. She pressed her own apples first, the Cortlands and Spies, and the Roxbury russets that Frank had named for her, and that had turned out to be among the rarest remaining examples of that variety in the state, which she learned from a woman named Dr. Celeste Marchand at the Vermont Land Trust, who came out in September with a soil sampler and a tape measure and a barely contained excitement. And then, on the second Saturday of October, she posted a handwritten sign at the end of the orchard lane and another at the Dennistown General Store. The sign said, "Bring your apples. We press for free." Frank Del Vecchio came first, with 3 bushels of his own empires in the back of his truck, and he stood at the edge of the press room and watched Nora run the press with the ease of someone who had been practicing all summer, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Harriet would have been glad." "I know," Nora said. By noon there were 11 families in the orchard lane, some of them with bushels, some of them with a single bag. An elderly man named Bertrand came with 6 apples from a tree in his side yard that he said had been there longer than he had. She pressed them. He got a mason jar of cider, cloudy and dark gold. He held it up to the light. He said it was the best thing he had seen in a long time. She did not argue. The grant from the Vermont Land Trust came through in February. It covered the cost of restoring the equipment shed, repairing the west roof, and establishing the orchard on a formal heritage preservation plan. No development, no conversion, no one's version of what 12 acres of old apple trees should become except the tree's own. Dr. Marchand had submitted the Roxbury russets as a priority conservation variety. The designation meant the orchard would be supported and monitored in perpetuity. That autumn she pressed her second commercial run, 400 gallons of single varietal cider that she sold at the Dennistown General Store and the Harwick Farmers Market, and to 2 restaurants in Montpelier who had heard about the Roxbury russets and wanted them specifically. She drove the 40 minutes each way every Saturday morning from mid-September through November. She drove it the way Harriet had driven it, and she knew she was driving it the way Harriet had driven it, and she thought that was not a small thing. She kept the photograph of her mother and Harriet on the wall of the press room, above the sorting table, below the painted sign. Ellen at 22, laughing at something outside the frame. Harriet beside her. The mill behind them. 2 women who had stood here before Nora existed, in a friendship that had left, across 50 years and through a hidden tin box and a quitclaim deed and a lucky dollar. Something solid for her to stand on. Every worth keeping goes through the press twice. Harriet had painted it and meant it and lived it. Nora understood it now. Not as a saying about cider, but as a saying about everything. The good things, the true things, the things that last, they do not emerge clean and easy. They go through pressure. They go through the weight of the thing that presses against them. And what comes out on the other side, if you have been careful and patient and honest about the work, is something clarified. Something you could not have gotten any other way. She was 18 when she was thrown out with 2 hours to pack. $1 and a deed and 12 acres of overgrown apple trees, and a tin box behind a loose board in a press room that smelled like 100 harvests. And what was inside it was not an inheritance of money. It was something older than that, a thread, stretched across 50 years of distance and silence, and 2 women laughing in front of a mill, connecting her to a mother she had lost, and a place she had not known was waiting for her. Everything worth keeping goes through the press twice. She knew that now. She pressed it twice. She kept it. If this story meant something to you today, I would love it if you shared it with someone who might need it, and please subscribe so you never miss the next one. Leave a comment and tell me, has something ever come back to you? A place, a connection, a piece of your own history that you thought was gone for good? I would genuinely love to read what you share. Thank you for being here with me. I'll see you in the next one.